In November 1942, when Soviet forces completed their encirclement of Stalingrad, German field commanders immediately recognized that the Sixth Army's survival required one action: break out immediately while the encirclement was still weak. Army Group Headquarters calculated they had perhaps 72 hours before Soviet forces consolidated positions and made breakout impossible. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, requested authorization to retreat. Every professional military officer who examined the situation reached the same conclusion: staying in the pocket meant destruction, breaking out meant saving the army. Hitler's response was unambiguous: the Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad at all costs. No retreat. No breakout. The city would be held regardless of circumstances. That order, to remain encircled in an indefensible position rather than preserve combat power through withdrawal, condemned over 200,000 German soldiers to death or capture and removed Germany's most powerful field army from the war at the moment it was most desperately needed elsewhere. Stalingrad had become strategically meaningless by the time Hitler ordered it held at all costs. The city's original value was as a transportation hub on the Volga River and an industrial center. By November 1942, both had been destroyed by months of fighting. The factories were rubble. The transportation infrastructure was unusable. The city itself was a devastated shell with no economic or logistical value remaining. Militarily, Stalingrad's position was now a liability rather than an asset. The Sixth Army occupying ruins consumed supplies while producing no operational advantage. Professional military assessment was clear: the city had no value worth the forces required to hold it. If the goal was denying the Volga to Soviet use, that could be achieved by holding positions west of the city without occupying the ruins themselves. Every practical military consideration argued for withdrawal to more defensible positions. But Stalingrad had acquired symbolic importance that overrode strategic logic. Hitler had publicly declared that Stalingrad would be taken and held. He had announced it in speeches. German propaganda had made the city's capture a test of will between Germany and the Soviet Union. The city bore Stalin's name, which in Nazi ideology made it a personal confrontation. This symbolic investment meant that withdrawing from Stalingrad was not just a military decision, it was a political admission of failure. Hitler had staked his personal prestige on Stalingrad. Retreating from the city meant acknowledging that his public declarations had been wrong. For a regime built on projecting invincibility and certainty, such admission was psychologically and politically impossible. The military irrelevance of Stalingrad's ruins was overridden by the political impossibility of appearing to retreat from a city Hitler had claimed would be held. Operational logic was subordinated to political necessity. The Sixth Army would stay not because holding Stalingrad served strategic purposes but because withdrawing damaged the regime's prestige. When Soviet forces completed the encirclement on November 23, 1942, German military professionals immediately understood the situation. The Sixth Army was trapped in a pocket approximately 30 miles wide with Soviet forces on all sides. The pocket contained over 200,000 German and Romanian troops with limited supplies. Winter was approaching. Relief would take weeks even if attempted immediately. Professional military doctrine for this situation was unambiguous: break out while the encirclement is weak, preserve the combat power, and establish new defensive lines. General Paulus requested breakout authorization. Field Marshal von Manstein, who would command relief efforts, recommended immediate breakout. Army Group Headquarters supported withdrawal. Luftwaffe logistics officers calculated that air supply to the pocket was impossible. Every professional assessment reached the same conclusion. the Sixth Army could break out if ordered to do so immediately. Staying in the pocket guaranteed destruction. The military recommendation was unanimous and urgent. Hitler's order to the Sixth Army was explicit and inflexible. They would hold Stalingrad. They would not attempt breakout. They would await relief by forces attacking from outside the pocket. Supply would be maintained by air. The order was not presented as a temporary measure while relief was organized. It was presented as operational doctrine: German forces do not retreat, they fight where they stand. When Paulus requested clarification about whether breakout was authorized if the situation became untenable, the answer was unambiguous: no breakout under any circumstances. The Sixth Army would hold or be destroyed in place. This was not a military order based on operational assessment. It was a political directive based on prestige considerations. Hitler was applying the same standfast doctrine that had been used during the Moscow winter crisis the previous year. That crisis had seemingly validated holding positions rather than retreating. Hitler drew the wrong lesson. He concluded that will overcame circumstances rather than recognizing that Moscow's situation had been fundamentally different from Stalingrad's encirclement. To justify the standfast order, Hitler promised that the Sixth Army would be supplied by air until relief forces broke through. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring assured Hitler that air supply was feasible. The professional logistics assessment told a different story. The Sixth Army required approximately 500 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat capability. Luftwaffe transport aircraft could carry perhaps 2 tons per sortie. That meant 250 successful sorties every day. Weather, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire would reduce that number drastically. Luftwaffe logistics officers calculated that air supply at required levels was impossible with available aircraft and airfield capacity. They presented these calculations to Göring, who dismissed them. When the numbers were shown to Hitler, he chose to believe Göring's optimism rather than the logistics officer's mathematics. The air supply promise was not based on practical feasibility. It was based on what needed to be true for the standfast order to be justified. Reality would have to conform to political requirements. For approximately 1 week after encirclement, the Sixth Army retained the combat power to break out through the weaker portions of Soviet lines. German forces in the pocket were still organized and supplied. Soviet encirclement forces had not yet fully consolidated positions. Breakout would have been costly, but it was operationally feasible. Professional military officers knew this window would close quickly. Every day the Sixth Army remained stationary, Soviet forces strengthened the encirclement. Every day consumed supplies that would not be replaced. Every day reduced German combat power while Soviet forces improved their positions. Field commanders requested breakout authorization daily. Each time the answer was the same: hold position, await relief, rely on air supply. By early December, the operational window for successful breakout had closed. Soviet forces had reinforced the encirclement too heavily. Sixth Army combat power had degraded too much. The army that could have broken out in late November could not break out by mid-December. The decision to stay had become irreversible through delay. Field Marshal von Manstein launched a relief operation in mid-December, attacking toward the Stalingrad pocket from outside. The operation was professionally planned and initially successful. German forces pushed to within about 30 miles of the pocket perimeter. At that point, Manstein requested that the Sixth Army break out to meet the relief forces. This would have saved most of the army. Paulus requested authorization to attempt the breakout. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would remain in Stalingrad and await relief forces to reach them. Manstein's forces could not push closer, they faced growing Soviet resistance and lacked sufficient strength to reach Stalingrad. Without the Sixth Army breaking out to meet them, relief was impossible. Manstein withdrew his forces to avoid their encirclement. The closest that salvation came to the Sixth Army was 30 miles, and political orders prevented the movement that would have closed that gap. After mid-December, relief was no longer possible. The Sixth Army was condemned to destruction by orders that prohibited the actions necessary for survival. The air supply operation failed exactly as Luftwaffe logistics officers had calculated it would. On good weather days, German transport aircraft managed perhaps 100 tons delivered to the pocket, 1/5 of minimum requirements. Bad weather reduced that to nearly nothing. Soviet fighters shot down increasing numbers of transports. Anti-aircraft fire claimed more. Airfields suitable for transports were limited and under constant artillery fire. By January, air supply was delivering less than 50 tons daily to an army requiring 500. Soldiers in the pocket were starving. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded died from lack of treatment. Horses were slaughtered for food. The promise that air supply would sustain the army was revealed as impossible, exactly as professional officers had said it would be. But acknowledging the air supply failure meant acknowledging that the Standfast order had been wrong. Hitler insisted that supply problems were due to insufficient effort rather than mathematical impossibility. The Sixth Army continued dying while political leadership refused to admit the policy had failed. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was disintegrating from starvation and cold. Soldiers were receiving less than 500 calories daily, starvation rations. Medical facilities collapsed. Wounded soldiers froze to death in unheated positions. Combat effectiveness degraded catastrophically. Units could no longer conduct operations. The army was dying in place while still being ordered to hold positions. Paulus sent increasingly desperate reports about the army's condition. He requested either supply adequate to sustain the force or authorization to surrender to save the remaining soldiers' lives. Hitler's response was to promote Paulus to field marshal and remind him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear: Paulus was expected to die rather than capitulate. The Standfast order remained in effect. The Sixth Army would fight until destroyed. By late January, effective resistance was ending, not from Soviet attacks but from starvation and exposure. The army was being deliberately sacrificed to avoid the political admission that the Standfast order had been wrong. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered after Hitler's promotion of Paulus to field marshal failed to produce the expected suicide. Approximately 90,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Over 100,000 had died in the pocket from combat, starvation, and exposure. Of those who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The Sixth Army had been destroyed not primarily by Soviet military action but by German political orders that prohibited the withdrawal or breakout that would have saved it. The army that surrendered in February could have broken out in November with most of its strength intact. The combat power that was lost represented Germany's best equipped and most experienced field army. That force was desperately needed elsewhere. Soviet offensives were threatening the entire southern front. The Standfast order had destroyed an army that could not be replaced at the moment it was most critically needed. The loss was not forced by operational circumstances. It was created by political decisions. The destruction of the Sixth Army created an immediate strategic crisis. The Southern Front lacked the forces to hold positions after Stalingrad's loss. Soviet offensives threatened to encircle additional German forces. Field Marshal von Manstein conducted desperate defensive operations with insufficient troops. The combat power that was destroyed in Stalingrad was exactly what was needed to stabilize the collapsing front. If the Sixth Army had broken out in November as field commanders requested, it would have been available for these defensive operations. Instead, those 200,000 soldiers were gone dead or captured because political orders had prohibited the military operations necessary to save them. The Standfast Order's consequences extended far beyond Stalingrad itself. It had removed Germany's strategic reserve at the critical moment. German forces spent the next months conducting desperate retreats to avoid further encirclements. The operational flexibility that might have allowed effective defense was destroyed by the loss of the Sixth Army's combat power. Stalingrad established a pattern that would repeat throughout the war's remaining years. Hitler would order forces to hold untenable positions for political or symbolic reasons. Professional military officers would request authorization to withdraw while withdrawal was still possible. Authorization would be denied. German forces would be encircled or destroyed in place. Each time, the justification was the same: German soldiers do not retreat. Each time, the result was the same: unnecessary destruction of forces that could have been preserved. The lesson from Stalingrad should have been that political standfast orders lead to military catastrophe. Instead, Hitler drew the opposite conclusion. He blamed the Sixth Army's destruction on insufficient will rather than on the orders that prevented rational military operations. The institutional learning that should have occurred did not. Standfast orders continued being issued. Forces continued being destroyed in place. Professional military advice continued being overridden by political directives. Stalingrad was not an isolated error that was corrected. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue until Germany's defeat. The Stalingrad decision revealed a fundamental dysfunction in German strategic decision-making. Hitler had publicly committed to holding the city, which made withdrawal politically impossible regardless of military necessity. This created a self-imposed trap. The more Germany invested in Stalingrad, the more important holding it became symbolically, which justified investing more forces, which made it more important, which prevented rational assessment of whether the position was worth the cost. Professional military systems have mechanisms to cut losses when positions become untenable. But Germany's system subordinated military judgment to political leadership that could not admit error. The Sixth Army was sacrificed not to achieve military objectives but to avoid the political consequences of withdrawing from a city that Hitler had claimed would be held. This was not strategic thinking. It was the logic of prestige overwhelming the logic of military necessity. Once the initial commitment was made publicly, every subsequent decision was constrained by the need to avoid appearing wrong. After Stalingrad, surviving German officers understood a lesson that their leadership refused to acknowledge: when political considerations override military necessity, armies get destroyed unnecessarily. The professional military culture emphasized preserving combat power and conducting elastic defense when circumstances required. But that culture had been subordinated to political authority that made decisions based on prestige rather than operational logic. Officers learned that requesting rational withdrawals was career-damaging and strategically futile. The institutional result was that professional military advice was increasingly ignored or not offered because the system punished realism and rewarded optimism. This created a feedback loop where leadership received only information that confirmed what they wanted to hear. Reality was systematically filtered out of decision-making until reality imposed itself through battlefield disasters. Stalingrad demonstrated this dynamic in its purest form. Every professional assessment said break out, political authority said stay, and 200,000 soldiers died as a result. The lesson was clear, but the system that created Stalingrad remained unchanged. Military historians analyzing Stalingrad identify Hitler's standfast order as one of the war's clearest examples of political interference destroying military effectiveness. The Sixth Army could have broken out in late November with most of its strength preserved. That combat power was desperately needed for subsequent defensive operations. Instead, political considerations about prestige led to orders that guaranteed the army's destruction. The decision was not forced by circumstances, it was chosen despite all professional military advice arguing against it. Field commanders correctly assessed the situation and requested appropriate authorization. Higher command correctly understood the operational requirements. But political authority overrode military necessity, and the predictable result was catastrophe. The pattern appeared throughout Nazi Germany's strategic decision-making. When ideology or prestige conflicted with operational logic, ideology and prestige won. The cost was measured in destroyed armies and lost campaigns. Stalingrad was simply the most concentrated example of the dysfunction that shaped Germany's entire war effort. When the Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, Germany lost more than 200,000 soldiers. It lost its most powerful field army at the moment that army was most needed elsewhere. It lost combat power that took years to replace and was never fully replaced. Most critically, it demonstrated that Germany's strategic decision-making was fundamentally broken. Political considerations were consistently overriding military necessity with catastrophic results. The standfast order that destroyed the Sixth Army was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a command system where prestige mattered more than preservation of forces. Professional military officers had correctly assessed the situation. They had recommended the right course of action. They had been overruled by political authority that could not admit that holding Stalingrad was not worth the cost. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad's ruins did not die because Soviet forces were stronger or because German arms failed. They died because political leadership ordered them to remain in an indefensible position rather than permit withdrawal that would have saved them. That decision was not made on military grounds. It was made to avoid political embarrassment, and 200,000 men paid the price.